Welcome to our 7th class on the book of Ecclesiastes. This class was taught on Tuesday, 12th May 2020 for the British Bible School in a Zoom class setting. The outline that we're sort of working with as we go through this book is this one here. We've looked at the first half of the book, the first 6 chapters. So far, Solomon has looked at wisdom, madness, and foolishness, as well as work and wealth. This week, we're going to enter a new section, which will look further into the differences between wisdom and foolishness. In fact, it'll be a study over the next few weeks. Just to quickly review what we've been through thus far on the first 6 chapters, we have the theme of the book that we've seen as we've been going through this. It's expressed in chapter 1 in this way. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Quite a depressing view of life, isn't it? But in this book, Solomon is searching for a meaning in life through a series of what we've been calling case studies. The ones that we're following are the ones that are outlined by Newt Heim in his Tyndale commentary entitled Ecclesiastes. And in it, the first case study is in chapter 2, and it's looking at pleasure and human achievement. Second case studies in beginning of chapter 3, that there's a time for everything, a beautiful poem there that we looked at. And then the end of chapter 3, he begins to talk about the need for justice, with the emphasis that God will judge all. Fourth case study in chapter 4 was an inquiry into exploitation and social injustice. And that was in the beginning of chapter 4. The middle of chapter 4 also had a case study, loneliness despite success. Even though you're successful, you just may still be lonely. The 6th case study was at the end of chapter 5. We had a bit of what they often call an interlude, the end of 4 and the beginning of 5. End of chapter 5, the 6th case study, misery that hoarding wealth brings. And also just after that, the self-induced misery that comes from the pursuit of success. So moved into chapter 6. In our last study, we saw misery despite abundant wealth in the first couple of verses. Notice that theme of misery going through there. And then the 9th case study, which is the last of them, misery brought on by no rest, because your wealth is not allowing it, and too many children. Everybody, so many mouths to feed, so to speak. At the end of most of these studies, most of these examinations, Solomon concluded with this. This is meaningless, a chasing after the wind, a grievous evil. Derek Kinder, in commenting on sort of ending chapter 6 and moving into chapter 7, had this to say. He said, chapter 6, which started by exposing a few empty lives, went on to uncover our human anthill, endlessly and meaninglessly busy, and finished by dismissing our fine speeches about progress. For all his talk, man on his own has no ability to change himself, no permanence, not even anywhere to make for. And so that's what he's been saying in those first 6 chapters, ending, of course, with chapter 6. In our study this evening, we move on into a new section of the book, emphasizing the contrast of wisdom and foolishness. And this evening, we're going to be looking at the first of these in chapter 7, and that is the advantages of wisdom. And when we look at the advantages of wisdom, they're going to sort of roughly fall into 3 categories. First of these, wisdom preserves those who have it. The second one, by the way, on that first one there, Hendry entitled that section in his commentary in the New Bible Commentary as the wisdom of death. When we get into the text, you'll see why. The second section, wisdom is a strength. And then the last part, God created humans upright. I actually had a hard time figuring out what to call each of these sections, and that's what I've sort of arrived at. So hopefully they will somewhat give the flavor of what's going on in those chapters. So let's look at chapter 7, and let's see the advantages of wisdom. We'll begin, of course, with the first section, the first 14 verses, that wisdom preserves those who have it. And so, if you would, I'm going to be reading from the NIV, but you can follow along on the screen, or you can read in your own translation. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It's better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This, too, is meaningless. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it's not wise to ask such questions. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter, as money is a shelter. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he's made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. So as we approach the conclusion of the book, just over halfway through here, Solomon turns his thoughts to examine one more area of life: wisdom contrasted with being a fool. As he examined the accumulation of wealth and indulging oneself in work, he's touched on this topic. But here he begins an examination of wisdom that will extend through chapter 10. In chapters 11 and 12, then he'll state his conclusion as to what life is about. There are a number of what we would call proverbs in this first section. Some of these we may agree with, some we may disagree with. Keep in mind, though, what a proverb is. That a proverb is a general statement of a truth. And being a general statement of truth, there will be exceptions, and we can probably find many exceptions to some of these. Derek Kidner commented that with his sure touch, the author now brings in a stimulating change of style and approach. Instead of reflecting and arguing, he will bombard us with proverbs, with their strong impact and varied angles of attack. The opening ones are provocatively cheerless. The rest, for the most part, provocatively cool and canny. So, he begins, a good reputation is better than fine perfume. And I think most would agree with that first part of verse 1. A good reputation is better than fine, or some translations, precious perfume. Our reputation, our name, your translation may have, is something that if we lose it, it's difficult to get back. And we could always save up for more precious, nice-smelling ointment. That would not be a problem. In fact, Solomon commented on this, or wrote about this in the Proverbs. In chapter 22, verse 1 of the Proverbs, he wrote, "A good name is to be chosen rather than great wealth, good favor more than silver or gold." Even though we might agree with that first part of this, we might disagree with the second part. The day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Derek Kidner said that the saying is so sweeping and so contrary to the normal outlook that we must either take a lap into the New Testament, where to depart to be with Christ is seen to be far better than to stay, or else we must read on and hope for clarification in the verses that follow. And I think we can see where he's coming from. See, when we look at births and beginnings, we look at these as a time of hope. In Solomon's mind, death is the conclusion of a life well spent. So there were no more bad things to go through, whereas a newborn has all this misery still ahead of him. And so I think that's where he's coming from. But it does prompt us to think a little bit about death, does it not? How do we view death? Do we view death as just the end of troubles? Or do we see death and focus on it being necessary so that we can be with God? And that's one of those things. We long to be with God, but we don't necessarily want to go through the means of getting there, and that is of ending the life on this earth. G.S. Hendry, in the New Bible Commentary, had, I think, a good comment on death and the way we look at death today. Keep in mind that he wrote this. This is published back in 1953, so this is almost 70 years ago. But I think it's a very modern thought. He says, "The modern flight from death, shown by the avoidance of serious consideration of it in popular thought, and even of all mention of it in polite conversation, as if death were a sleeping dog one could pass on tiptoe, is the index of a view of life to which death has no meaning, save that of an irrational brute fact which rudely interrupts man's efforts and aspirations. Man's hopes today are bound up with a progressive postponement of death and the dream of its eventual elimination." And I think that's just as true in 2020 as it was when this was published back in 1953. We still have not come to terms of dealing with death. But of course, in our current climate, with the coronavirus, death is suddenly thrust to the forefront every day as we hear the number of people who have died of this virus. Death is a fact of life. Death is something that we all need to be prepared for. Psalm 90 is attributed to Moses. It's said to be a prayer of Moses. And I think he has the right idea here about how our lives should be. He said, "Teach us to number our days so we can have a wise heart." Isn't that true? Live with death in view, realizing our days are numbered. And I think the older we get, the more we realize that. But teach us to number our days so we can have a wise heart. We might ask, is it better to go to a funeral, a house of mourning, than a feast? Well, Solomon says it is. Why did he think it was? Well, as Solomon explains it, death is the destiny of every person, and we need to take this to heart early on in our lives. Spending time around death might help us to center this in our minds, and maybe that's the idea that he's thinking. In the same way, he stated that frustration was better than laughter. And again, I'm not sure we would totally agree with that. In fact, we might have a wealth of information to back up that laughter helps to get rid of frustration. Laughter can help to change our view of life, and it can help us to overcome depression. But so we know these things from the research that has been done today. But Solomon believed otherwise because, as he says, a sad face is good for the heart. Or the NET has, sober reflection is good for the heart. He seems to be saying here that all the frivolity over things that don't matter doesn't really help us live our lives, in his opinion. If we want to be wise, our hearts, Solomon says, will be in the house of mourning, apparently taking stock of our lives, whereas the heart of fools is in the house of merrymaking. I think we would acknowledge that there is some truth to that observation, although we would not want to totally get rid of laughter. We've seen those who take nothing seriously, and sometimes they end up in serious trouble. Sadness, though, can be replaced by something far better. We see this same idea reflected in other scriptures as well. Paul wrote, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, our temporary minor problems are producing an eternal stockpile of glory. For us, that is beyond all comparison. Of course, Job reflected the same idea in Job chapter 33, verses 19 and 20. So Solomon continues, it's better to listen to the rebuke of the wise than the song of the fools. The rebuke a wise person can give us would be far better to listen to than the songs that fools sing. Again, the first can help us in our lives, while that last part there offers no help and simply wastes our time. Solomon says the song of fools is short-lived and of no benefit. He compared the laughter of the fool to the quick burning thorns that might be used to start a fire under a cooking pot. The analogy seems to be they're short-lived, and as a result, this is meaningless. This is useless. That phrase, the term thorns that's been used here in the text, and that Bible study had a note on it and says the term thorns, the Hebrew words is hasirim, refers to twigs from wild thorn bushes which were used as fuel for quick heat but burn out quickly before a cooking pot can be properly heated. In other words, we might use them for kindling, and anything we use for kindling is going to burn up fast, but we use that to get the real wood or whatever we're using to burn going so that we can get the cooking pot properly heated. So that's what the thorns is there. Denny Petrillo commented that in discussing the futility of the laughter of the fool, Solomon made a pun in the Hebrew. As the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. By the way, that doesn't come much like a pun in English, does it? He suggests that maybe the best equivalent is Moffat's translation, like nettles crackling under kettles. That may be the idea going on there. The expression, though, is comparing the fool's laughter to a sudden flame. It flashes up quickly and makes a great noise, but it's soon gone. Foolish laughter vanishes quickly because it is empty, having no basis in reality. Of course, there are circumstances that can change a wise person into a fool, such as oppression, or even trying to extort somebody, or a bribe, which corrupts the person. So Solomon says the end of the matter is better than its beginning. But this is almost arriving back at verse 1. It could be in Solomon's mind that the end is better because you've completed your task. You've arrived at your conclusion. You no longer have to work through whatever it is that lies ahead of you. And in the same way, he says patience is better than pride. I think we would definitely agree with that. as we can see that being patient, having a patient spirit, is far better than having a spirit of pride. Derek Kidner commented, whether or not we regard patience as a virtue and quarrelsomeness as a vice, we can at least see the practical good sense of self-control, of following a matter through instead of dropping in at the first affront to our dignity. It is not the only kind of area in which the wrong course can also be deflatingly described as the childish one. It's interesting, during our current coronavirus crisis, I've been amazed at the patience and the calm replies that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, as well as the ministerial team in Downing Street, have consistently given, even when it seems the journalists are trying to goad them. Patience is a far better way to answer. I think they're answering far better than I could do in that situation. Solomon continues, though, anger is a problem that fools have. So make sure you're not easily provoked. Again, I think that is very good advice. I think we would agree with that. How often do we look back at the past and think of these as the best years of our lives? We enjoy nostalgia. We enjoy remembering the good things of the past, of course, while forgetting the difficulties we went through. I often say we enjoy longing for the past while using our microwaves, our iPhones, our iPads, the things that we didn't even have in the past. I've been very thankful that we have the technology we have today that we didn't have before, especially during this crisis, because at least we can stay in touch with family and we can talk to them, we can see their faces, even though we cannot physically be there. Solomon's advice is that it's not wise to ask if the days of old were better than today. Don't long for the good old days. Warren Wiersbe commented, it's been said that the good old days are the combination of a bad memory and a good imagination. And often this is true. I think he hit the nail on the head there. So his initial conclusion about wisdom. It's a good thing, he says. It's like an inheritance. It benefits those who see the light of day, those who are alive, those who are under the sun. It can provide protection. It's a shelter, just as money and wealth can provide some protection. The advantage of wisdom over foolishness is this. It preserves those who have knowledge. It can preserve the life of its owner. And I think we could see how this could easily be the case. Because if we know that there's a problem, for instance, in this coronavirus, we know that if we mix with other people in large gatherings, that more people are going to get it and this virus is going to go out of control. So wisdom, the knowledge we have, teaches we don't do that, and hence we're in lockdown. Derek Kidner commented that the phrase in verse 11, an advantage to those who see the sun, may well be a double-edged remark. A reminder that there is a time limit to the help that even wisdom, at this level of general good sense, can offer. It pays no dividends in the grave. We need to listen to wisdom now, don't we? So we need to consider what God has done. He's sort of concluding this section with an admonition there to remember the work of God. Can anyone change what God has done? Literally there it says, can anyone straighten something that he has made crooked? Can we change something God has done? You know, God gives us times of prosperity and times of adversity. Good times and bad times. We need to accept them both. And we need to realize that God gives them both to us so that we can't know what the future holds for us. It's not all going to be smooth sailing. nor is it all going to be dreadful. As we've heard frequently during this crisis, this virus will be over at some point. And sometimes it seems to stretch on, but it will be over. Derek Kidner wrote that verse 13 is speaking not of moral crookedness, but of the shapes of things and events which we find awkward, but should accept from God. It includes his judgments, but also presumably many of life's trials, as the next verse suggests. That verse is a little classic on the right approach to good times and bad, which is to accept both from God for what they can give, not with the Stoics' impassiveness, nor with the restlessness of those who cannot bring themselves to accept a bonus with delight, or a blow with an open and reflective mind. Kidner concluded this section, his commentary, the message of Ecclesiastes, with a little poem. I assume it's a hymn by Richard Baxter. It's entitled Ye Holy Angels Bright. I'm not familiar with it, but it had these words. I thought they were good. Take what he gives and praise him still, through good or ill, whoever lives. The rhyme there is interesting as well, isn't it? Where the first line rhymes with the fourth and the two middle lines rhyme together. But it is very well expressing what Solomon is saying here. So we'll move on into the next section, verses 15 down to 22. We'll see him continuing to look at wisdom and his conclusion that wisdom is definitely a strength. Verse 15. In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these. The righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living long in their wickedness. Do not be over righteous, neither be over wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers of a city. Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. Kidner began the section by saying, now comes the cynicism in verses 15 to 18, the shabby and self-regarding side of common sense. To show us the logic of the secular position, Koheleth shuts out for a while any gleam of genuine faith. We'll get to that later, of course. Koheleth, of course, being the Hebrew word for the teacher. So this is referring to Solomon. So what has Solomon observed? He seems to have considered his life to be meaningless because although he could observe and see the problems, he's unable to change them through his wisdom. During his fleeting, meaningless life, he says he's seen two things, two observations. Sometimes there were those who were righteous who died having lived short lives. Or as the text puts it, the righteous perish in their righteousness. And sometimes there are those who are wicked who lived long lives despite their evil deeds. So his conclusion is simply this: don't be excessively righteous or wicked. Don't be over-righteous because that might destroy us. Don't be over-wise. You might end up being disappointed. And don't be excessively wicked. Don't be a fool because you might die too soon. By the way, the idea behind not being excessively righteous could be to avoid being self-righteous or having an inflated view of your own goodness or justice. So the RSV may have, by the way, the best translation of verse 16. Do not make yourself over wise. I like that. The idea seems to be not thinking too highly of yourselves or to be wise in your own eyes. And Solomon talked about that in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7 as well. Petrillo says that this is not a warning against trying to become either righteous or wise. Everyone should set such goals. Rather, it relates to the problem of self-delusion and self-importance. So, he's observed all of these things. He's concluded that you should not be excessively wicked or a fool, or you might die before your time. By the way, the fool in Solomon's writings is characterized by stupidity and overconfidence. It's a person who's easily influenced and shows no common sense. And although he mentioned 4 things, there are but 2 warnings here. And people need to listen to both. If they would fear God, they will follow these warnings. God provides the balance between the 2 extremes of righteousness or over-wise and wickedness, as well as wisdom and foolishness. We must learn the lessons of balance and avoid extremes. But, he says, wisdom does have its positive aspects. It gives the wise person more protection, more strength than 10 rulers in a city. It goes on to say, there isn't an absolutely, truly righteous person who always does good and never sins. And there wasn't one until Jesus came. So maybe what he's saying in all this is trusting in people will at best let you down at times. He is saying, I think, that we need to keep a realistic and balanced viewpoint, especially when it comes to people. It may also is also good not to pay attention to everything a person says, especially about you. You might even hear people saying bad things about you, even those who are under you, your servants, if we don't have those today, of course, but those working under you. And he goes on to say, would that be any different from what we ourselves do? Do not we say things about people that we should not say at times? I think we can relate to that. How often have we been in the midst of saying something, or somebody's been in the midst of telling us something about somebody, and the person they're talking about, the person we're talking about, suddenly shows up and they're there as well. Suddenly we've got to do some quick backtracking because we should not have said that. We misspeak as well. This illustrates that there is no one who always does right and never sins. Denny Petrillo wrote, hateful statements are sometimes made by kind-hearted people. We know that we ourselves have spoken hasty words that we did not really mean. We have all been guilty of sins of the tongue. We are warned to be cautious with our words. Since all have sinned and all have said unkind things that they did not mean, they've cursed others, the cursed listener should realize that he's many times been guilty of doing the same. And before we point fingers excessively at somebody for what they're saying about us, realize that we do the same thing. Charles Spurgeon wrote, you cannot stop people's tongues, and therefore the best thing to do is stop your own ears and never mind what is spoken. There is a world of idle chit-chat abroad, and he who takes note of it will have enough to do. And that is wise advice. Notice that's from his lectures to my students as he was training people to become teachers and preachers. As we finish this section of Ecclesiastes, look then towards God and how he created man in the first place. Solomon wrote, all this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I'm determined to be wise. But this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who could discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom in the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things while I was still searching but not finding. I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they've gone in search of many schemes. And by the way, we'll sort of return to that theme when we get into the last chapter as well. So, Solomon has used his wisdom to examine all these things. And he had wisdom, God-given wisdom. He was determined to understand and comprehend everything by wisdom. But he discovered that this wisdom was beyond him. In fact, he says it's beyond any human understanding and far deeper than anyone can fathom. It's way too profound. The Net Bible Study Notes points out that in Hebrew, literally, he's saying it is deep, deep. Who can find it? The repetition of the word deep emphasizes the degree of incomprehensibility. If we've ever been in a boat looking into deep, deep water, it's incomprehensible. We can't see down there, can we? I think that's the idea going on here. Derek Kidner wrote that the honest admission of failure to find wisdom, of watching it in fact recede with every step one takes, discovering that none of our soundings ever gets to the bottom of things, this is, if not the beginning of wisdom, a good path to that beginning. So, he's searching. He's searching for an answer to what is life about. And he's been trying to comprehend the role of wisdom in things, to understand the stupidity of wickedness, the insanity of folly. What is life about? But thus far, nothing has provided any answers for him. We've been through now into the 7th chapter, and everything's meaningless. Although he says what he did discover was this: worse than death is a woman who is like a hunter's snare. Her heart, he says, is like the hunter's trap. Her hands are like prison chains. Danny Petrillo quoted a fellow named Michael Eaton and said he discovered that a woman can create such havoc in a man's life that it brings painful suffering more bitter than death. Of course, the man who pleases God escapes her, but it's the sinner who is captured by her. Goes on to say that the wording here, as well as verse 28, has sometimes offended women, but the inspired writer was only providing the male perspective. A woman could easily have said the same thing about this kind of man, and that's true, isn't it? This is not a one-sided idea that's going on here. And he discovers all this while trying to understand the scheme of things. Goes on to say that he has found only one upright man, no upright women in 1,000. He's been continually looking for upright people. Only one amongst 1,000, and none of them being women. As Derek Kidner says, how are we to take this? For a start, we should notice that he's not dogmatizing, but reporting. This is one man's experience, and he does not universalize it. But what is more to the point is that he exposes to us the part that sin can play on both sides of an encounter between the sexes. His fruitless search for a woman he could trust may tell us as much about him and his approach as about any of his acquaintances. It is tempting to add he might have done better to have cast his net less widely than among 1,000. He also says as much in chapter 9, verse 9. We'll get to that, with his praise of simple marital fidelity. You often wonder if the number of wives he had has clouded his judgment. 700 wives, or 1,000 wives and concubines. It seems though that in all of this, what he's saying is this is specifically relating to wisdom. Wisdom is so very rare, it is almost impossible to find in humans. But he says there was one thing that he had discovered, and it's this: God created mankind upright. He made humans upright. Well, that reflects very well on Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, doesn't it? The humans he created were the ones who left God. They went in search of many schemes. I think we could add many evil schemes. And people still do that today. Derek Kinder says, after the gropings of this chapter, this verse brings the refreshing certainty that our many devices, our clouding of moral issues, our refusal of the straight way are our fault, not our fate. Since futility was not the first word about our world, it no longer has to be the last. And he'll get there. He'll get there. Who can tell man what will be after him on the earth? You can't do that. This is Solomon's report. Well, as wisdom has shown, and we can see his frustration coming through here, and we can see he's not satisfied with the way his search is going. G.S. Hendry wrote, "The conclusion, which is the utmost which human wisdom can attain, is that man has fallen from the state in which God created him, and through his cleverness has brought about his own undoing." It's we who are at fault, not God. What lessons can we learn from this particular chapter? I think there's several things that come through this chapter. For Christians, the day of death is a good day because it is a day of victory. If you think about it, that's true, isn't it? We don't have to fear death. That is the day of victory. And Paul wrote about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. When we encounter death, if we're at a funeral, I think that should help us to value life more, and maybe be a good time to reflect on our own life. I think we can see in all this as well that we need to finish what we start. In all areas, but maybe especially in our marriages, as well as in our faithfulness to God. I think we can see our need to control our anger. An uncontrolled temper makes its permanent home in the heart of a fool. And we cannot live in the past. We need to seize the opportunities of today to serve God, improve ourselves, and encourage others. It is so tempting the older we get to reflect upon how good it was when we were children, when we were younger, and not realizing that these are the best days we have because we're alive right now. Other lessons would include we need to appreciate that life brings both good and bad days. And when we have good days, we need to enjoy them. When bad days come, use these to become people of even stronger faith, stronger resolve. We need to realize that sometimes the righteous do suffer and the wicked do prosper. God has not promised everything's going to be smooth sailing if we follow him. He's not promised that we're going to have prosperous lives because we are Christians. The wicked only appear to prosper if we take a short view of things and we leave out eternity. So we need to have a realistic view of ourselves, not one that is inflated, not one that is self-deprecating. And we need to learn not to overreact to the words of others by being less sensitive and being less sensitive to what they say, and also becoming more forgiving when people say things about us. And we need to stop doing ourselves about others, don't we? And it is sin that makes life meaningless. By the way, this is why Jesus is such good news, because he came to take away our sin and give meaning to our lives once again. In so many ways, Jesus is the answer to Solomon's search, isn't he? Thank you for listening to this, and we hope that you will continue to study God's Word.